Kilayim, we are up to Yutes Amud Aleph, towards the bottom, the very last line actually, and we're talking about grid. Now this shit is being recorded, but the text version will be following later. Okay, that might take just a bit of work maybe later on. For now, it's just an audible audio and the video, but without the text in the screen. Okay, so we're talking about you're allowed to plant various species in a field without separating them. Now, a grid is a piece of dry land in the middle of your field. Now, it's distinct. It looks different. So you can have the whole field with one type of plant, and this patch of dry land, you can put a different plant. All right? It's so different from everywhere that's irrigated. This is like a very dry piece. So it's a separate area, okay? And what you plant there, therefore, is not kilayim with what's next to it, okay? It's certain types of vegetables. We're not talking about grain, but it's certain types of vegetables. And basically, the field has got vegetables, and then the grid therefore looks different. It stands out, okay? So it's because the rest of the field is vegetables. So now, Rabbi Yochanan. Now there are some conditions for this grid. So first of all, you have to plant, if you are going to plant something in this grid, it should be 3 out of 6 tfachim of a row. So basically you're like 3 rows of the 6. So the grid is perhaps a 6 by 6 grid, okay? Get the pun. It's a 6 by 6 grid. And you're planting maybe 3 tfachim of it. 3 of the 6 tfachim across have to be planted. Otherwise it's not considered a separate area, and the crops are kilayim. Now, ushloisha shehed smuchin legeder kagrid. Now also, if you have 3 tvachim of land and it's next to a fence, right? 3 tvachim of land next to a fence, okay, if it's like next to a fence at the edge, so you 3 tvachim and you've got a fence, that's also okay. Now that area is hard and dry, and it can combine with the dry land, so the sort of the fence area can combine with the dry land to make a 6 by 6 tefach row where you can grow these other species as well. Okay, so you've got like 3 tvachim next to the fence. Got a strip next to the fence. Let's see this again. The 3 tvachim next to a fence, right? They can be treated as dry land, right? Okay, because again, it's hard land. So a 3 tvachim strip next to the fence can combine with 3 tefachim strip of dry land, again, to make a grid of this 6 tefach where you can throw other species in it. Now, there are cases where another plant planted on a dry patch can be extended into an irrigated land. Usually the dry patch is not irrigated. But what about Hayu Shloisha B'Toich Shisha? So let's say you have 3 out of 6 tefachim sown with one type. Okay? Ve'echad Chuz L'Shisha. You have 1 tefach out of that 6 tefachim. So let's say on its right, in the diagram we've got here, you've got 6 tefachim, 3 tefachim, 3 of unplanted, 3 of one type. Then you have 1 tefach of the same type as the one of one type. So the echad chutz shisha, 1 tefach is outside the 6 tefach area, on a sort of irrigated land, next to another species, maybe which is on the other side. Ma'acha shehutzlu elu, the 3 tefachim in the dry patch are saved from kilayim, because they're next to 3 dry. Avzeh hutzal, the tefach in the irrigated area is also saved from kilayim. Do you understand? So that the 1 tefach is next to 3, and the 3 is part of the 6, which is fine. So the 3, which is species A, is next to the 1 tefach, which is species A. Now then you've got species B on the side, but the 1 sort of joins up, and that 1 is part of the 6 as well. Even though it's not within the 6, it's got a din as if it's saved as part of the 6. Right? The whole area is considered a single entity. Okay? Let's carry on. Hayu shnayim b'toich shisha. Right. So now, we've got 2 tfachim out of the 6 of the dry row with 1 type of species. Okay? And then, ve'echad chutz l'shisha. Again, you have 1 row beyond the 6, so let's say on the far right, we'll put that, and that's irrigated land. So you've got 2, you've got 1 on the far right, and then, and 1 is on the outside the 6, and you have a field of another species on the far side of the dry row, so you've got further down on the other side, you've got species 2. Ma'acha shaloi hutzlu elu, the 2 tvachim in the dry patch are not saved from the Kilayim. Avzeh lo hutzal, so the tefach on the far right is also not saved. The tefach outside the dry patch is also not saved. Okay? So here you've got species 2, you've got 4 tvachim of unplanted land, 2 tvachim of species 1, but it's only 2. We need 3 as part of the grid. You've only got 2. There's 1 next to it, but that's outside the 6. So since the 2 is not saved, that 1 is also not saved. So when you've got 3 being saved, then 1 next to it is also saved. But when you've only got 2, we can't count the 1 outside to be saved. Hayasham grid shura, if there was a row of dry land, the shura geder, and a row alongside a fence, right? So you've got a fence on the far side, you've got a strip alongside the fence, you've got irrigated land, you've got dry land, okay? So now, Hayasham grid shura, so you've got a row of dry land, the shura geder, a row of a fence, the shura b'chayvshin es hashura, the dry rows which surround that irrigated bit in the middle, they close in on 2 sides, and the 3 rows are regarded as 1, and you can have a single crop. So dry land, irrigated in the middle, they close in, it's all considered one entity. Okay? Now, they basically nullify, so all 3 are considered as a single area. They're all one area. Now, a fence or a ditch is a separation between fields, okay? Now, we're going to have a case where you sow 1 crop in one field and another on top of a fence. So, Gabo shall geder kasada. With Kilayim, if you've got a crop on the top of a fence, it's like in a higher up field.
Well, they say
because we've taught
like a wall, don't they?
a wall, yeah, a wall. Because we've learnt in a brisa, shtei sadai zua gabzu, you've got 2 neighbouring fields with different species, and one is 10 tefachim higher than the other one. Ha'eliyona smucha lachavetz, the upper field, it's as if it's next to a ditch, 10 tefachim deep, so it's a separate entity. V'achtachtayna smucha legeder, and the lower field is as if it's next to a wall 10 tefachim high. So the 2 fields are not Kilayim because one is 10 tefachim above the other one. They're considered separate fields. Ravi Anai Amri, they said, Geder, if you have a fence, Mutal is Rabba, you're allowed to plant on top of it, Komin Tulbechina, any species you want, even if the neighbouring field has a different species. The Geder, now a fence of 10 tefachim is the gap between fields. The Geder, Yesh bo lahakal, Yesh bo lahachmeh. There are sometimes a leniency and sometimes a stringency. Hey Chavi, that was the case. So, Parachas mi beis rova, mukrach b'terch sadeh tzivua. Let's say you have a field, and you've got an area less than a beis rova. Beis rova was, remember, 104 square amas roughly. You've got an area less than that cleared right in the middle of the field of grain. Asid is roba, you can't sow something else there. Hikifu geder, however, once you surround that little cleared area with its own fence, then you've separated it out. Then mutter, you're allowed to sow a foreign species there. And that's the case where a fence will make you a kula. You've got an open area, 104 amas usually is not enough to sow other things in there, but because you surround it with a fence, it's a separate field, you can sow something in there. Beis rova babika, you got a beis rova of unplanted land in an unplanted area. Mutil is rabba shnei minin, you can sow 2 species there, as long as you leave a beis rova of space between the 2, so you'll put stuff on one side, stuff on the other side, beis rova gap in the middle. But hikifa geder, once you surround the whole area with a fence, then it becomes one area. Then also, then you can't sow the 2 species there. So here, you're surrounding the area, not just the beis rova, but then you can't sow 2 species. The reason is, when 2 species are surrounded by a fence, the fence brings them together, they're a single planting. And even though there's a beis rova in the middle, they're still Kilayim with each other. Okay, so that's where a fence results in a stringency. Now we also taught plants in a dry area and those on top of a fence are not Kilayim with the neighbouring fields. Now, Geder Zerua, you have a fence where you've got seeds on the top covered with plants. Mao Shiyat Silas Azraim. What's the din? Can it save the plants on either side from Kilayim? Because you've got a fence with extra plants on top. Can that separate the 2 neighbouring fields? Grid Zerua, a dry patch that's again seeded, covered with plants, can that save the vegetables in the fields on either side from kilayim? Do the plants growing on the fence or in this dry area make a chatzitze, or make a gap between the different species in the two fields? Rav Shmuel v'shem Rav Elazar Shama Lamin Hada, he learned from the following: now, you can have two different species next to the roots of a tree, and they've dried out. The roots have dried out. So you can have one part species on one side of the roots, because the roots are chatzitza between the two, and one plant on the other side of the roots. But that's because the roots have dried out. But if they're still living and moist, then it's also, they can't separate everything. That's because live sprouts, live roots, they produce vegetation, so they can't separate the fields. So it should be the same with a fence, where you got stuff growing. It shouldn't be capable of separating fields of different species, because things are growing there, it shouldn't be capable. Rav Yossi Shama ben Hada, he learned the opposite from the following Mishnah. Somech lebo ulanir ulagapa. So you're allowed to put different types of species next to either uncultivated land, ploughed land, a stone wall, a road, a fence, right? Uladach uladerech ulagader, a fence shugavaya asara tfachim, a fence 10 tfachim high. Uleilan shumeisech halaretz, a tree that you've got branches covering the ground, and you can put next to that different species. Hada amra shageda zarua matzeles hazroim. So you see that a fence that has seeds and a dry patch that's got things growing, it still saves the plants on various sides from being kalayim. But then the Gemara rejects that, because I feel a tema engeda zarua matzeles hazroim. It could be a fence that's seeded doesn't save things on either side from kalayim. Now the Mishnah said the tree is a separation between species. Maybe it doesn't help us. Why not? Because Shani Hacha, the case is tree is different. Shugada Zarua, it's like a fence with seeds. Bein Gada Zarua, Matzilas Azraim. A fence that's got seeds, it can't stop the fields which are also sown with seeds. They're all the same. Right? They all look alike. So it causes the fence and the fields as one entity. And whereas a tree would be different. It's different in appearance, right? The leaves from the tree are different from seeds. You understand? So if the seeds are on a fence, they can't separate fields of seeds. Whereas a tree, however, might be able to, because the leaves of the tree are not the same as the seeds which are on the ground. Maybe the tree is a proper separation. Rabbi Yehuda asks, Grid ul Meshech. You got dry land and irrigated land. Marashin Stafu, do they join up for this 6 tfachim, grid? Hey Chavida, what's the case? So imagine you got an unplanted area, you got a field of grain, and you've got a row of vegetables, and you've got a gap between the grain and the vegetables, right? You've got a rectangle of 10.2 amas. It says 10.5, but whatever, say 10.2. 10.5 amas, and a gap or a width of 6 tfachim, of which 3 tfachim is dry, 3 tfachim is irrigated. So now, what do we say? There's which doesn't need any dry land. Doesn't really need any dry land. You've got a 6 tfachim gap, vegetables there, grain there, 6 tfachim gap, that's fine. Now, also grid mikan. If you made a, one second. Right, you had 10.5 amas by 10, right, sorry. If it was 10.5 amas long and 6 tfachim wide, fine. Just assume 6 tfachim wide gap, fine. Then you don't need a dry land. Enosar grid. Also grid mekan, mao lismach mishtei ruchaisav. Now what happens if you put a strip of dry land, let's say, on one side. Now, if you did make a strip of land, the dry land on one side, was the din about planting, let's say, grains, vegetables, next to the two sides of that area? So does the dry area combine? That's the question now. It's one thing if you had a space of dry area, but here we don't have a space. We've got 3 tfachim dry, 3 tfachim irrigated, right? Does the dry combine with the irrigated to make the 6 tfachim gap? Or maybe you need entirely one type of land, this 6 tfachim gap between vegetables and grain. Maybe it has to be 6 tfachim proper, right? In other words, in the diagram here, they put both cases in this story. Basically, it's one thing if you have a gap of dry land, Fine, that separates between grain and vegetables. But what if you've got a 3 tvachim grap of dry land and 3 tvachim of irrigation? And that's the question, and we don't have the answer to that. Now, also if you have a stone, a rock, 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide, that's the gap between various things that are growing. What about if it's less than 10 tvachim? Tani, Rabbi Yonasan ben Yossi Omer, he said, Hayasham sela aruka asara, barocha rabba, 10 tvachim long, 4 wide, but less than 10 tvachim high. It's allowed to plant different species on the two sides, separated by the length, because it's like 10 tvachim away. If the rock was 10 by 10 square, you can plant different stuff on all the 4 corners of the 4 sides. Because if it's 10 tvachim away from each other, so then it's 10 away, on all 4 sides you can plant different species. You want to make your field into many plots of different species. Now, I said Asara Esrim Ba'arba Krachas LeBeisar. Now, a Beisar is how big? A Beisar is 6 kav of barley seeds. It's a square of 50 amas by 50 amas, which is 2,500 square amas. Okay? Now here, a base roiva means a roiva is a quarter. Here's a quarter of a kav of seed, and a sar is 6 kav. So basically, it's 24 base roivas. So you want to divide your sar of land into 24 equal parts, and each part will measure a base roiva. Okay, so 2,500 divided by 104 roughly gives you 24. Okay, so now. So base sar will be 2,500, 24, as I said, it will be roughly 10.2 by 10.2 each square. And that's the base roiva. Some divide it into 24 rectangles of 10 by 10, 2.5, 10 on one side, 10 amas on one side, 10 and 2.5 tvachim on the other. Each rectangle is a base roiva. Right, some say it's a square of 10.5 amas. But it's not a base roiva, it's 10.5 on all 4 sides, because then it would be more than 2,500 square amas, okay? So different calculations as to how you get it all. So let's assume this person, either imagine it's 24 squares, right? A rectangle, 24 squares. So I say, Esrim Ma'aba Karachas LeBeisar. Beisar, or Mikrachas base roiva, each plot can have a base roiva, as we said. The Zarea Basacha Komin Shiyezah. You can plant wherever you want in each square. So the maximum number of species you can plant in the base sar is 24, because you'll have 24 squares of 104 square amas, and each one you will plant a different species. Okay? Now, okay. If you've got 1 or 2 unplanted areas, Zayron Chadol, you know what? You can plant them with mustard. Right? This is a blazer. You've got various base roiva plots all over the place. You want to sow 1 or more, let's say, non-adjacent areas with mustard. You could do other permitted crops as well. Of course you can. You do as many, we said up to 24 different base roivas. The problem is, when you want to use mustard, in a base sar, you're only allowed 2 squares of mustard, because mustard takes over the place. So if you want to start putting mustard in, you can do 1 or 2 squares. But shalosh, if there are 3 unplanted plots, lo yizreim chadol. Don't start planting them with mustard. It appears like a field of mustard. It feels like the mustard is taking over. That's Rameir's view. The Chachamim said, Teisha karachos mutaris. You can have 9 plots, the 10 asuris, and 10 are forbidden. So according to them, it seems now the Chachamim go against Rameir, about 24 base roiva. According to them, you've got no special allowance for square plots for a base roiva. Basically, you've got to sow as you would normally separate the areas required between different species. Now the Chachamim said only 9 squares will be allowed in the base sar. We're going to discuss this, okay? How we get the 9, we're going to discuss this. But 10 asuris, but 10 are forbidden. Reb Lezer ben Yaakov, he said, Afilu kol sadeo base kol. Your field might be a base kol, which is 30 base sar. La yase b'soicha chutz mikarachas achas. You can only make a single plot of a different species. So what that means, there's no special allowance for square base rova plots. He's got much stricter than Chachamim. He has a single field, even as big as base core, cannot have more than 2 species in a plot of a base rova or more. You can't have more than 2 species in a plot of a base rova. You can have various plots if they're less than a base rova, but if they're a base rova or bigger, you can only have 2 of them. Right? The 2 species require the normal degree of separation between them as well. Okay? Right, let's carry on. Now the Chachamim said, we're looking at the machlokes between Rameh and the Chachamim. Rav Chizkiah, Rav Yasser, Shem Rav Yochanan said, Al Rosha, the Chachamim were talking about the beginning of what Rameh said, which was the maximum number of squares you're allowed to have in a base cell, where Rameh said 24, and they said 9. Now let's see. Rameh holds you can have these base rova areas even if they're closed in by other species, even if they're connected to other species. He says you can plant as many as 24 in a base cell. Okay? The Chachamim said no. They mustn't be closed in by other species, they mustn't be next to other species. You've got to have some serious gaps here. Now the Chachamim only allowed you to have 9. How do we work out the 9? Hey Chavida, how is it done? How do you get the 9? So, Telas, V'tati v'chada, V'tati v'chada. 3 and 2, and 1 and 2 and 1. Rabbi say, that is Greek. 3 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1. Now, if you imagine, so let's start with a grid of 25 base rova squares, okay? A 5 by 5 grid. Only 24 are really part of the base cell. The 25th one is just to make it clear what's going on, okay? So now, in a grid of 5 by 5, based on what we've said so far, you can have 3 in the top row. If you've got the Art Scroll Gemara where it's got little P's in there, you've got 3 in the top row, 1, 3, 5. Then you have 2 in the next row, square 2 and square 4. Then you have 1 in the third row, which is line square 1. 2 in the fourth row, which is line 2 and 4. And 1 in the fifth row, which is 1 again, right at the bottom. So 3, 2, 1, 2, 1. Now there are a number of questions on this. I mean, where does this come from? I mean, why do we need all these spaces? If you don't want things to be next to each other, what's wrong with 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 1, 3, 5? Nothing's near each other. Nothing's adjacent. Do you understand? Obvious question. So out of 25, you should really be allowed to have 1, 3, 5, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. You should really get 13 squares. However, we have been told 3, 2, 1, 2, 1. So now, not everyone obviously likes this chart that we've given, that it's only 9 squares. Because of this question, why can you not have 13 squares? Okay, so the others, that's the problem. What's wrong with the other squares that you're not bothering with? Why limit it to 9? Right, the Pnei Moshe's got the problem, Aram Fulda's got the problem. The Chazon Ish says that the Chachamim hold there's no special allowance for base rova squares. You have to comply with usual laws of Kilayim. And even if they're not adjoining, they're not surrounding, you can't have more than 9 squares in a base cell. More than that, you give an appearance of a mixture, and it's a problem of Kilayim. So that's how the Chazon Ish learns. It just looks bad when you have more. Even though there's no next to each other, they're not adjacent, nothing. That's one shot. So although a base cell might have more than 9 squares, they're not adjoining, not surrounding, you can still only have 9. You mustn't give the appearance of things mixing together. Okay? The Rambam holds, according to the Chachamim, there's a special allowance for base rova squares, but not like Rameh who says you don't need a separation. The Rambam holds you need a minimum distance, lesser than usual, and if usually you need a separation of a base rova, which is 10.2 by 10.2, but here he needs 9.7. The base saw is 50 by 50 amas, divided into 5 rows in each direction, 25 squares, 1, 3, 5, 3 and third and fifth row is a base rover, you leave others unplanted. Basically it works out 19.4 amas for the area separating the base rover, each area is 9.7. You'll have to leave certain distances between everything, and therefore according to the Rambam your 9 squares, 135, 135, 135. Do you understand? In your 5 by 5, you're 135, 135, 135. That's how the Rambam will learn. Okay? So that's the maximum base rover squares in a 50 by 50 base saw with the required 9.7 amas. The Rambam is not bothered by this 3, 2, 1, 2, 1 calculation, right? It could be he didn't have the girsa at all. Instead it's 9 boxes according to the Rambam. Okay? The Rosh also ignores this 3, 2, 1, 2, 1. Could be they have a different version in the girsa. Who knows? It could be that they have a completely different wording. Alright, but that's given enough explanation as to some of these numbers. Let's carry on. Haisa karachas achas. Where are we? So we are to the next bit. Halacha ches, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Kol shuhu b'seich rov base rover. Now, you've got various species, let's say, requiring a base rover separation. Now, kol shuhu b'seich base rover, anything that's within a base rover, oila b'midas base rover, is counted towards the measure of a base rover. So let's say you've got an unplanted area of a base rover to separate 2 fields, which have got different crops. Okay? So the Mishnah says if you've got an unplanted base rover, it's got areas that can't be cultivated, that still serves as a separation for the 2 fields. So let's say a water crevice or whatever it is. So any area you can't plant there helps as a base rover to separate 2 fields. So achlas hagefen, the work area of a grapevine, v'akeva, a grave, v'hasela, a big rock, oilin, b'midas base rover, they all count towards the measure of the base rover area. Tavua b'tzvua, you're planting grain next to grain, base rover, you need a base rover separation. Yerek b'yerek, vegetables next to vegetables, shisha tfachim, you need a 6 tfachim gap between them. Okay, you want to put different fields with different species vegetables, you need an area of 6 by 6. Okay, some say not by 6 by 4 tfachim on the whole length of the field. As long as you've got an unplanted area of 6 somewhere along the boundaries of the 2 fields, the borders can converge after that, and they can be next to each other as long as you've got one area of 6 by 6 separating the various types of species of vegetables. That's where you've got full-size fields of vegetables. Okay, right. Let's carry on. It's a Rabbanan din, by the way, the 6 by 6 separation. Minator, you only need a tefach gap. Okay, let's carry on. Tvua base rover. Yerek b'yerek shishat vachim. Tvua b'yerek b'tzvua. You got grain next to vegetables, vegetables next to grain. Base rover. You need a whole base rover separating. Rebbe Lezer says yerek b'tzvua. Vegetables next to grain. Shishat vachim. You need a gap of 6 tvachim. Right? He says vegetables planted next to grain. You need a distance between the vegetables of different species, 6 tfachim. Okay? Tvua naita al gabe tvua, if grain is leaning over grain of another species, v'yerek al gabe yerek, got vegetables leaning over vegetables of another, tvua al gabe yerek, or grains leaning over vegetables, v'yerek al gabe tvua, vegetables over grain, hakol mutter, it's permitted, so they are separate, but they're sort of leaning over a bit, okay? They're planted in accordance with the proper separations, but they grow across the divide. They start leaning over one of the opposite fields. They were properly separated, right? There's one exception, chutz midalas yavonis, except for the Greek pumpkin. The Greek gourd, it has a long stalk and very large leaves. And when it comes into contact with other plants, it gets entangled with the other species, and that gives an appearance of kilayim. Rebbe said, af hakishus upula mitzri, there's other types of melons and Egyptian beans that also mustn't lean over other plants. But I think that the words of the Chachamim are more correct than mine. So he had a tradition to include this other type of melon, the other type of Egyptian bean as being entangling, but he himself said, well, I think they are correct in their tradition, and therefore it does not cause a problem. Rabbi Birnbach here, B'Shem Rav Zeira. We said the work area around a grapevine you can use towards measuring your base rover. That's where the work area around a grapevine. The grapevine itself, that cannot count towards the base rover measure. Lama, why is that? It's forbidden to get any benefit from it. You can't plant any crops there where it's a proper vine. That's Kilayim Daf. You can't plant any crops over there. Now a grave is also forbidden to get benefit. And yet you said that counts towards the area. So the Gemara answers kever with a grave, it's not noticeable that therefore it counts towards the area. What about the work area around the vine? You can't get any benefit from that. That's also forbidden. It should be like the vine itself. It shouldn't be included in your area. Ela kabishma. And Mishnah follows the view of Yishmael. Yishmael Lama Yishmael said, Ein avoda legefen yechidis. There's no issue on planting in the work area of a single grapevine. So that's why the area counts towards the measure of base rover. Right? The place of the grapevine is prohibited for planting. It doesn't count towards a base rover area. Okay? There's no problem with that. Now, tzvur b'tzvur, base rover. When you're planting grain next to other grain, you need a base rover separation. Now that allows you the nearby planting of a different species. That's only if your species that you're planting, you can't close it in on four sides by another species. If one is completely enclosed by another, then it's a problem, even though you have a base rover separation. Rav Zira by Kumar Rav Yasa, he asked before Rav Yasa, Kinan Amrinan. So do we say Hadar Bikas Simunia? Now the valley of Simunia, Ein Zon Nesachal Amin Achab. We can say now, we can only sow in it a single species. Basically, it was surrounded by mountains, which made a wall all around it. So it was surrounded by a fence, so you couldn't plant more than one species in the whole valley, because even a base rover separation can't permit two species if the area has been fenced in. You understand? So because there's mountains around it, it's been as if it's been fenced in. Okay. Rabbi Lezer said, for vegetables next to grain, 6 tvachim. Ma'aseh Rabbi Lezer asked the Chachamim, Kiva Madi is l'chai, Kal, the Shura v'chai b'meruba. Now, you've got a din that a row of vegetables is more lenient, but a square of vegetables is more strict. It seems this is what you hold, right? It's a challenge. Here's more responding to them. You seem to have a difference in din, we'll see soon, between a row of vegetables and a square of vegetables. Hachanami isli kal b'meruba. I also hold that a square is more lenient, whereas a full-size field is more strict. So a square of vegetables alongside grain, unlike a full-size field, needs a separation of just 6 tvachim. So you're saying, I've got a leniency with a square. Now, it doesn't really make sense. Let's see, we'll see what he's saying. Let's see what he says again. You've got a leniency, a law of a row is lenient, a square is strict. I also hold a square is more lenient. That's what he said to them. Now, what's going on here? Let's see. Where do we see in the Chachamim that have a leniency with a row and a severity with a square? That we've learnt in a brayta. You want to make a row of vegetables in a field of grain. Okay? A row of vegetables in a field of grain. You can make a separation along the length of a row. Right? It says, okay, length of a row. 10.5 amos long. By a width of 6 tvachim. Okay? So a row of vegetables next to grain, separation 10.5 by 6. That's it. And that's following the Mishnah, which says a 6 tefach separation from row vegetables in a grain field. Okay? Must measure 10.5 amos long. We don't mention in the Mishnah about a length, but the Bryce elaborates what you need to know. So if the row in the field are longer than 10.5 amos, you need a 6 tvachim across it, and that's fine, and then you can grow other things on the borders on either sides. Okay? With a square patch, the Chachamim say you need a full base rover, 10 by 2 by 10 by 2. So they are actually stricter with a square than with a row. Right? So this is the so far of a row of vegetables alongside grain. Our Mishnah, which deals with a square patch of vegetables next to grain, needs a whole base rover. So you see the law of a row is more lenient than that of a square. Okay? Okay. Now, our Rav Yochanan, we'll stop in a few minutes, our Rav Yochanan, Now, so it's all very well, you're lenient with a row as against a square. Rabbi Yochanan, now, he's saying, in the 6 tefach row in a grain field, you can have one type of vegetable, not more than one species, even if they are separated. So he's talking about a 6 tefach row of vegetables, 6 tefach across, row of vegetables in a grain field. You need at least 6 tefachim, that's the minimum for a row, okay? And he says you can have a single species of vegetables in that row. Usually you can plant more than one nearby, as long as they're separated by, say, 1.5 tefachim of unplanted space. But here you can't, because allowing a row of vegetables in a grain field applies, it says, where you've got to have a significant row. It's got to be something significant, right? 6 tefachim of a single species, right? But if it's many different strips, it's not a single entity. It's just different things all assorted together, so it's a problem. So what is he allowing us? Let's see this again. You can put a 6 tefach row in a grain with one type of species, but not more than that. Rav Zira said, however, Rav Yochanan agrees, if you have a row 7 tefachim wide, then you can have tefach mikan, the tefach mikan, you'd have 1 tefach one side, 1 tefach on the other, and chamisha nidanin lekan. And those 5, the unplanted area in the center, can be counted for this side and for that side. Okay, so you've got 7 tefachim wide row, and you can have a different species along the length of the row on one side, in the strip, measuring 1 tefach, another one on the other side. The 7 tefach row is in the middle of a grain field. There's grain on each side of the vegetables. Each species of vegetable is allowed as part of its own 6 tefach row composed of that species, and each species must be planted at 6 tefach removal from the grain. And since the 2 species don't share a single 6 tefach space, they're permitted. The 5 middle ones are part of each of the sides. So each 1 tefach planting considered on its own is part of an individual row measuring 6. And since the 5 tefachim in the middle can be counted for each side, each meets the requirement set that we needed. Okay, now what you see from Zeira, that according to Rabbi Yochanan, you don't have to plant more than 1 tefach out of 6 in this row of vegetables. But min ma da'amar Rav Zeira said about Rabbi Yochanan, Nesivin ad Rabbi Yochanan Tamon, they raised a question in Bavel about another of his dinim, which seems to apply you need to grow a bit more. Because, actually I'm wondering, I think we will stop here.